The alarm did not sound like the alarms we trained for. It was thinner, higher, almost polite, as if the station itself did not want to believe what it was reporting. I was halfway through a cup of reheated coffee when the message came through, and I remember thinking, in the half-second before I understood the words, that the light in the room had changed color. It had not. My mind was simply trying to explain the feeling in my chest before my ears had caught up. My name is Daniel Cole. I worked as a human liaison officer aboard Meridian Station, a joint outpost shared between 6 species, sitting quietly at the edge of a peace that had taken decades to build. My job was small and unglamorous. I translated tone, not just words. I explained why a human engineer's blunt joke was not an insult, and why an alien trade envoy's long silence was not a threat. I was good at my job because I liked people, all kinds of people, whatever shape they came in. That morning, my job stopped mattering. The transmission came from Halden's Reach, a small human colony 3 jumps out, a farming settlement of a few thousand people who grew grain under domes because the air outside was too thin to breathe. I had visited once, years earlier, for a supply audit. I remembered wide fields under artificial light, and a school building painted yellow because the colony administrator said children needed color, not just survival. The recording was short. A woman's voice, breathless, cutting in and out. She said there had been an incursion. She said ships had come in low, past the perimeter sensors, faster than anything registered in the treaty logs. She said the school dome had been hit. Then the signal died. Not gently, but the way a signal dies when the equipment sending it stops working, or stops existing. I sat very still for a long moment. Around me, the operations deck of Meridian Station kept moving, alerts scrolling, officers calling out status checks, but I felt separated from it, like I was watching through glass. Colonel Grace Doyle, the station's ranking human officer, was the one who pulled me back into the room. She put a hand on my shoulder, not hard, but firm enough to anchor me. "Cole," she said, "I need you fluent and useful in the next 10 minutes, not somewhere else in your head." I nodded, though I was not sure I believed myself. Within the hour, we had confirmation. A patrol ship reached Halden's Reach and sent back a report that was read aloud in a briefing room full of officers from 4 different worlds, and I watched every one of their faces as the words landed. The colony's outer defenses had been disabled. A faction calling itself the Krell Ascendancy, a splinter group not officially recognized by any major alien government, had raided the settlement under the claim of resource reclamation. In the chaos, the school dome, where children had been sheltering during a supply drill, was struck. The report did not linger on details. It did not need to. The room understood enough. What I remember most clearly is not the report itself, but the reaction around me. The alien officers present, representatives from the Aliven Concord and the Thrask Trade Union, looked grim, but composed. One of them, a tall Aliven diplomat named Kessa Vantrell, who I considered a friend, turned to me and said something that she meant as comfort. "This is a terrible thing," she said, "but border factions like the Ascendancy act outside law constantly. Your colonial administration will file a formal grievance. The Concord will support sanctions. It will be handled through proper channels." I looked at her, and for the first time since I had known her, I did not know how to explain something to her. "Kessa," I said, "you don't understand what's about to happen." She tilted her head, the way her species did when confused, feathers along her jaw lifting slightly. "What do you mean? This is a diplomatic matter." I did not answer right away, because I was watching something happen on the other side of the room that told me more than any words could. The human officers on the deck, people I had worked alongside for 2 years, people who joked in the mess hall and complained about supply delays and played cards on slow shifts, had gone quiet. Not panicked, not shouting, quiet, in a way that felt heavier than noise. Colonel Doyle was speaking into a secure channel, her voice level, almost soft. A young lieutenant named Ethan Marsh, who I had shared a dozen easy conversations with, was standing very still near a console, staring at nothing, his jaw tight. An engineer I barely knew had stopped what she was doing entirely, and was simply looking at the floor, breathing slowly, like she was gathering something inside herself. I had seen human anger before. I had seen arguments, frustration, even grief. This was none of those things. This was something older, something that did not need to raise its voice to be understood. Kessa noticed it too. I saw her expression shift, the confusion giving way to something more careful. "Daniel," she said quietly, using my first name, which she rarely did. "Why does the room feel like this?" I tried to find words that would translate not just the meaning, but the weight. "Where I come from," I said, "there is one thing that sits underneath almost everything else we believe. Laws change, governments change, borders change. But protecting children is not treated like a policy. It is not treated like a value we debate at dinner tables. It is older than our history books. It is close to instinct. When someone crosses that line, they are not just breaking a law. They are stepping outside the boundaries that make cooperation possible at all." Kessa considered this for a moment. "Every species protects its young, Daniel. This is not unique to humans." "You're right," I said. "But the reaction to failing that protection is not the same everywhere. For many of your people, and for many species on this station, response is measured, proportional, filtered through committees and treaties and careful escalation. For us, when this line is crossed, the response does not always wait for permission. It does not always come from a chain of command giving an order. It can come from something else. Something that does not ask first." I do not think she believed me. Not fully. Not yet. I do not think anyone who had not grown up inside human history could believe me. But I saw a flicker of unease cross her face, the first hint that she understood she was standing near something she did not fully understand. Over the next hour, I watched that unease spread through the station like a slow tide. Communication logs showed unusual activity across human channels, not panicked chatter, but short, clipped exchanges, coordinates being shared, old contact codes reactivating that had not been used in years. A retired officer stationed on a nearby transport hub sent a single message to Colonel Doyle that I later learned simply read, "I am available." 2 more messages like it followed within the hour, from people who had left active service long before I ever set foot on Meridian Station. Nobody had ordered them to respond. Nobody needed to. I stood near the observation window later that evening, looking out at the slow turn of stars, and Kessa joined me, her presence quiet at my side. "Your colonel has not raised her voice once," she said. "Your soldiers are not shouting for revenge. I expected anger to look different." "It does not need to be loud to be certain," I said. She was silent for a long moment, watching the stars with me. "What happens now, Daniel?" I did not have a full answer yet. I only had the shape of one, forming slowly in the pit of my stomach, the same place where the alarm's first sound had landed hours earlier. "I don't know exactly," I admitted, "but I know it will not stop at a formal grievance, and I know it will not be filed through proper channels the way you expect." Kessa turned to look at me fully, her golden eyes catching the low light of the corridor. "That sounds like a threat." "It's not a threat," I said quietly. "A threat is something you say to change someone's behavior before they act. This is already decided. What's coming isn't a warning. It's a certainty." Behind us, the station continued its quiet, steady hum, unaware that somewhere beyond its hull, in ships and homes and old retired quarters across a dozen worlds, humanity had already begun to answer a question no one had officially asked yet. I finished my coffee, long gone cold, and set the cup down on the console beside me. Kessa did not speak again for a while. Neither did I. We simply watched the stars, both of us aware, in our own ways, that something had shifted that could not be shifted back. Later that night, unable to sleep, I walked the lower ring of the station, where the observation ports faced outward toward open space. I found Ethan Marsh there, the young lieutenant from earlier, sitting alone, with his hands loosely clasped in front of him. He did not look up right away. "You knew someone there," I said, not really a question. "My cousin taught at that school," he said. His voice was steady, but there was a tightness behind it, the kind that comes from holding something very carefully so it does not spill over. "She used to send me pictures of the kids' drawings. Spaceships, mostly. Every kid on that colony wanted to be a pilot." I did not know what to say, so I sat down beside him instead of speaking. Sometimes presence is the only useful language. "I'm not angry the way people think anger looks," he said after a while. "I'm not going to break anything. I'm not going to yell. I just feel very clear right now. Like everything unimportant got stripped away. and what's left is simple. What's left? I asked. He looked at me then, and his eyes were calm, in a way that unsettled me more than tears would have. We fix it. Not out of hate, out of duty. There's a difference, even if it doesn't look like one from the outside. I thought about Kessa's question from earlier, what happens now, and I realized I finally had a better answer, even if it was one I could not fully explain yet, even to myself. Somewhere beyond the station's hull, in the dark distance between stars, something had already begun moving. Not chaos, not rage, something quieter, and far harder to stop. I did not sleep that night. I do not think anyone on that station did. By the third day, Meridian Station felt like a different place. The corridors were just as clean, the lights just as bright, the schedules just as fixed, but something underneath all of it had changed. The way a house feels different after you learn something true about the people living in it. I spent most of that day in meetings, translating not language but intention, trying to help alien representatives understand why human behavior on the station had shifted so completely, and trying, at the same time, to understand it myself. Kessa found me during a break between sessions, in the small kitchen area near the diplomatic wing. She poured 2 cups of a warm Eleven drink that smelled faintly of citrus, and offered me one, without asking if I wanted it, which by then had become something like a habit between us. I read the historical files you suggested, she said, about human conflicts tied to the protection of children. I did not expect there to be so many. Not wars exactly. Smaller things. Laws written overnight after single incidents. Our entire policies changed because of one child, one case, one moment that became unbearable to your people collectively. That's not unique to conflict, I said. It shows up everywhere in human history. It's in our stories, our religions, our oldest laws. Across cultures that never spoke to each other, that never shared a border or a language, the same pattern shows up again and again. Harm a child, and something in human societies responds as though the entire structure of trust has been threatened, not just one family. But why? She asked. Biologically, protecting the young exists in nearly every species that raises offspring. It's not just biology, I said. It's identity. Children represent continuation. They represent the part of us that hasn't happened yet. When that gets threatened, it isn't just personal grief. It becomes something closer to an attack on the idea of a future at all. Kessa was quiet for a long moment, turning her cup slowly in her hands. Your colonel has not requested additional resources from the Concord. She has not asked for military support. And yet ships are moving. I have seen the traffic logs. Independent vessels, some registered decades ago and never active until now, are converging toward Halden's Reach. I've seen the same logs, I admitted. Who is coordinating them? I thought about that question carefully before answering, because I wanted to be honest, not dramatic. I don't think anyone is, not in the way you mean. There's no single order being given. It's closer to instinct, spreading through a network of people who already know what needs to happen, without needing to be told. Kessa set her cup down. That frightens me more than an official military response would. Why? Because official response can be negotiated, she said. Orders can be countermanded. Chains of command can be reasoned with. What you're describing has no single point of control. There is nothing to appeal to. I did not correct her, because she was right. Later that afternoon, Colonel Doyle called me into her office, a small room with a wide viewport overlooking the docking bays. She looked tired, in a way I had not seen from her before. Not weak, but weighed down by something she was carrying carefully. I need you in the room tomorrow, she said. Admiral Laura Bennett is arriving from the Ninth Fleet. She's requested a joint meeting with Concord and trade union leadership. I want you translating, and I want you paying attention to more than words. Understood, I said. Can I ask what the meeting is about? Doyle looked at me for a long moment before answering. It's not a negotiation, Cole. It's a courtesy. I did not fully understand what she meant until the next day. Admiral Bennett arrived without a large escort, which surprised the alien delegations more than a show of force would have. She was a tall woman, with gray threading through dark hair, and she moved through the station with the unhurried calm of someone who had already decided how the day would unfold, and felt no need to convince anyone of it in advance. The meeting took place in the largest conference hall on the station, a curved room with seating arranged around a central table, meant to suggest equality among all parties present. Kessa sat near the Eleven delegation. Representatives from the Thrask trade union sat across from them, along with two smaller species who held observer status on the station. Admiral Bennett did not open with a demand. She opened with a description. 3 days ago, she said, a faction operating outside recognized governance, struck a civilian settlement, and caused harm to children sheltering during a routine drill. I am not here to discuss blame in the abstract. I am here to describe what is already underway, so that no one in this room is surprised by what comes next. A Thrask representative, an elder trade official named Orun Kethis, spoke first. Admiral, the trade union condemns this action in the strongest terms. We are prepared to support formal sanctions against the Krell ascendancy through Concord channels. I appreciate that, Bennett said, and she meant it, I could tell, but her tone did not shift. Sanctions will matter for the political aftermath. They will not matter for what happens in the next several days. Kessa leaned forward slightly. Admiral, with respect, what exactly is your government planning? My government isn't planning anything, Bennett said. That's what I need this room to understand. This isn't a government operation. There's no formal declaration, no committee vote, no strategic directive from a central authority ordering fleet movement toward Halden's Reach. Then whose ships are moving? Orun asked. People's, Bennett said simply. Colonists with private vessels. Veterans who left service years ago. Logistics crews who know the sector better than any strategic map could show. Independent contractors who have never worn a uniform in their lives. They are organizing themselves, sharing information, coordinating routes, because they already understand what needs to happen, and they are not waiting for permission to begin. The room fell silent. I watched the alien representatives exchange glances, trying to process something that did not fit into their understanding of how conflict worked. This is unprecedented, Kessa said quietly, a response with no central command. It's not unprecedented for us, Bennett said. It has simply never been aimed at your part of the galaxy before, because nothing like this has happened before. Orun's feathered crest lowered slightly. A gesture I had learned meant deep unease among his species. Admiral, if there is no command structure, how can this possibly be limited? How can it be controlled? Bennett's expression did not change, but her voice softened slightly, not with sympathy, but with something like patience. It will be controlled because the people involved understand exactly what they are responding to, and exactly who is responsible. This isn't blind rage sweeping across a border. It's precise, it's focused, and it will not touch anyone who was not involved. How can you be certain of that? Kessa asked. Because that's who we are, Bennett said. We protect what matters to us fiercely, and we are equally careful about who we hold responsible when that protection fails. Those two things exist together, not separately. I watched the room absorb that statement, and I understood, perhaps for the first time fully myself, what made this moment different from anything the alien delegations had encountered in their long history of managing conflicts between disciplined governments and armies. There was no one to negotiate with, because there was no single mind making the decision. There was only a shared understanding, spreading quietly and completely, among millions of people who had all reached the same conclusion independently and simultaneously. After the meeting ended, and the delegates filed out, Kessa remained behind with me in the emptying hall. She looked shaken, in a way I had never seen from her before, her usual composed posture slightly bent, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Daniel, she said quietly, I need you to answer me honestly, as a friend, not as a liaison. Always, I said. What exactly comes next? I looked at her for a long moment, choosing my words carefully, because I understood that whatever I said next would shape how she, and through her, how her entire government understood humanity from this point forward. What comes next, I said slowly, is not chaos. It is not revenge in the way your species understands the word. It will be quiet, controlled, and absolute. It will end with the people responsible no longer able to harm anyone again, and it will do everything possible to avoid harming anyone who was not responsible. And if it cannot avoid that, she asked, if there is no way to separate the guilty from the innocent cleanly, I did not have a comfortable answer to that question, so I gave her an honest one instead. Then it will still happen, because for us, allowing children to be harmed without consequence is a line that cannot be left uncrossed, no matter how difficult the response becomes. Kessa was silent for a long time, staring out at the stars through the wide viewport, the same stars we had watched together 2 nights earlier, before any of this had a name. "I do not know if I understand your people at all," she finally said. "Most days," I said, "neither do I. But I understand this part clearly, and after today, I think you're beginning to as well." She did not answer, but she did not need to. Her silence carried its own understanding, heavier than words, settling over the room, like the quiet that had spread through the station 3 days earlier, and had not left since. The days that followed the meeting with Admiral Bennett moved strangely, both too fast and too slow at once. Reports came in steadily from Halden's Reach, as recovery teams reached the colony, and each one landed on the station like another small stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everyone who heard them. The school dome had been struck during the drill, when most of the children were supposed to be sheltered underground, but a mechanical failure in the shelter doors had left a portion of them still inside the upper structure when the attack happened. I will not describe what the recovery teams found in detail, because some things do not need to be described to be understood. What matters is that the colony's small clinic, meant to handle broken bones and seasonal illness, was suddenly overwhelmed, and the colony's request for medical support was answered within hours by ships that had not waited for any official dispatch order. Colonel Doyle kept me close during those days, not because my translation work was urgently needed in the moment, but because, I think, she wanted someone nearby who understood both sides of what was happening. I did not ask her directly. I simply stayed near, made myself useful where I could, and listened. On the 5th day, I was called into a smaller meeting, this one without the wider Concord and trade union delegations present. Only Colonel Doyle, Admiral Bennett, myself, and Kessa, who had specifically requested to attend as an observer with the colonel's approval. Admiral Bennett looked less rested than she had days earlier, but no less composed. She had a data slate in front of her, and she did not waste time with preamble. "We have identified the Krell Ascendancy's primary staging location," she said. "A cluster of unregistered facilities in a debris field, roughly 2 jumps from Halden's Reach, outside any recognized territorial claim. Independent intelligence, gathered largely by colonists and traders with local knowledge of that sector, has confirmed the location with reasonable certainty." "Independent intelligence," Kessa repeated slowly, "not official fleet reconnaissance." "Correct," Bennett said, "though fleet assets have verified it since." Kessa's feathered brow lifted slightly. "You are telling me that private citizens found this before your formal military did." "I'm telling you that private citizens often know a sector better than any centralized system ever could," Bennett said. "Traders who fly the same routes for decades, retired officers who once patrolled that exact debris field, people who grew up near enough to know which asteroids hide sensor blind spots. When something like this happens, that knowledge doesn't sit quietly. It gets shared, freely, immediately, with anyone who might use it well." I watched Kessa absorb this, and I understood what unsettled her most. It was not the violence of what was coming. It was the structure of it, or rather, the visible absence of structure, replaced by something distributed and organic that moved faster than any formal system could match. "What is the plan for the staging location?" Kessa asked carefully. Bennett's expression remained level. "Removal of the threat, nothing more, nothing less. The facilities will be disabled. Personnel directly involved in coordinating and carrying out the attack on Halden's Reach will be identified and dealt with. Personnel not involved, support staff, unaffiliated workers, anyone who can be reasonably separated from responsibility, will be given the opportunity to withdraw safely." "And if they refuse to withdraw?" Kessa asked. "Then that becomes their choice, not ours," Bennett said. "But every effort will be made to give that choice clearly and in advance." Colonel Doyle spoke for the first time in several minutes. "This isn't about erasing a faction from existence, Kessa. It's about making certain they can never do this again, and making certain every other faction watching understands exactly why." Kessa turned to me, as she often did when she needed a translation that went beyond words into meaning. "Daniel, help me understand something. Your admiral speaks about restraint, about separating the guilty from the innocent, about giving warnings before consequences arrive. And yet the entire galaxy is watching independent human ships converge on a location with no oversight, no treaty authorization, no international consent. How do these two things exist together? I thought about her question for a long moment before answering. Because for us, I said, restraint isn't the absence of action, it's a discipline practiced during action. We're not holding back because we're uncertain. We're being precise because we care about who this touches, even while we're certain about what needs to happen to the people responsible. That is a very fine line to walk without a central authority enforcing it, Kessa said. It is, I agreed. But it's a line most of the people involved have walked their entire lives, in smaller ways, long before this moment. Discipline isn't something ordered into existence during a crisis. It's something built over years, in how people are raised, in what they're taught matters, in the kind of restraint expected of them, even when no one is watching. What's happening now isn't new discipline. It's old discipline, applied to something enormous. Kessa was quiet for a long while after that, turning the idea over the way she often did, before speaking again. I would like to ask something difficult, she finally said. May I? Of course, I said. If this operation is successful, if the ascendancy is removed as a threat, what happens to the wider relationship between humanity and the rest of the Concord? Will this be remembered as an isolated response to an isolated tragedy, or will it change how every species here understands what humanity is capable of? I looked to Admiral Bennett, unsure if the question was meant for me or for her. Bennett answered it herself. It will change things, she said simply. It should. Not because we intend to threaten anyone, and not because this changes who we are day to day. We'll still be the same people trading resources, sharing research, laughing in shared mess halls, building friendships across species lines. But everyone watching should understand something clearly now. Something that maybe wasn't obvious before. Our patience is real. Our generosity is real. But there is a line beneath all of that, and it does not move, no matter how patient or generous we appear otherwise. A line drawn around children, Kessa said quietly. A line drawn around children, Bennett agreed. And around anyone unable to protect themselves. It's not a policy we debate case by case. It's closer to a foundation everything else is built on top of. The meeting ended not long after that, without further questions, the weight of what had been said settling over the room like a held breath no one wanted to release too quickly. That night, I could not sleep again, and I found myself back at the observation window in the lower ring, where I had sat with Ethan Marsh days earlier. This time, Kessa joined me instead, standing quietly at my side, her golden eyes reflecting the distant light of stars neither of us could name. I have known humans for 11 years, she said eventually. I attended your universities. I studied your history. I believed I understood your species reasonably well, perhaps even better than most of my colleagues. And now? I asked. Now I understand that I only ever saw the version of humanity that chooses patience, she said. I never saw what exists underneath that choice, waiting quietly, until it is called upon. It doesn't get called upon often, I said. That's important to understand too. This isn't who we are every day, or even most days. It's not the first thing about us. And honestly, most humans go their entire lives without ever being close enough to something like this to see it directly. But it exists, Kessa said. Reliably, predictably. Yes, I said. She turned to look at me fully then, her expression unreadable in the low light. Is that meant to comfort me, Daniel, or frighten me? I considered the question honestly before answering. Both, I think, I said. It should comfort you, because it means our compassion isn't performance. It's not something we perform for treaties or trade advantages. It's real, all the way down, deep enough that it produces something this absolute when it's violated. And it should give you appropriate caution, because that same depth means the consequence, when it comes, is not something that can be negotiated away once it begins. Kessa was silent for a long moment, watching the stars. I think, she finally said, that I understand your people better tonight than I have in 11 years combined. I think, I replied, that most of the galaxy is about to understand us a little better too. Neither of us spoke again for a long while. We simply stood together at the window, watching the quiet dark, aware that somewhere beyond it, ships continued moving steadily toward a debris field, 2 jumps from Halden's reach, carrying with them a resolve that had not needed a single order to begin, and would not need one to finish. The following morning, Colonel Doyle informed me that the operation would begin within 48 hours. She did not ask if I wanted to be present for updates. She simply told me I would be, because she believed, correctly, that someone needed to help the watching delegations understand what they were witnessing, not just report the facts, but carry the meaning behind them. I spent that day walking the station slowly, past the docking bays where a few remaining independent vessels were completing final preparations, past the mess hall where conversations had grown quieter but not colder, past the small chapel near the residential ring where a handful of people sat in silence, praying, or simply thinking. I could not always tell which. Everywhere I went, I felt the same steady current beneath the surface calm, the same quiet certainty that had first appeared the moment the alarm sounded 5 days earlier. It had not grown louder over time. It had simply grown clearer, sharper, more focused, the way still water reveals its depth the longer you look into it. Kessa found me again near the end of that day, standing outside the observation deck, watching one of the last independent ships undock and turn slowly toward open space. "Are you afraid, Daniel?" she asked quietly. I thought about the question honestly before answering, the way I tried to answer all of her questions. "Not for what's coming," I said. "I'm afraid of how the galaxy will remember it. I hope it's remembered correctly, as discipline, not as rage, as protection, not as punishment for its own sake. Because if it's remembered wrong, it won't teach anyone the right lesson. It'll just make people afraid of us, without understanding why. And if it's remembered correctly," Kessa asked, "then maybe it teaches everyone something worth knowing," I said. "Not to fear us. To understand us. There's a difference, even if the two feelings sit close together at first." Kessa nodded slowly, watching the ship shrink into the distance until it disappeared entirely into the dark. "I hope, for all our sakes, that it is remembered correctly," she said. I hoped the same thing, more than I had hoped for almost anything in my life, but hope, I was beginning to understand, was not the same as control, and control, in this moment, belonged to something far larger than any single person standing at that window. The operation began quietly, the way most true things about that week had begun quietly, without announcement, without ceremony, without anyone standing before a camera to declare its start. I learned it had begun the way most of the station learned it, through a shift in the mood around me, rather than through any formal notice. Colonel Doyle's office door, usually open during working hours, was closed. Admiral Bennett's aide moved through the corridors with a focused efficiency that told me more than words could. And Kessa, when she found me near the communications deck, simply said, "It has started," and I understood immediately what she meant. We were given limited access to updates, filtered carefully to protect operational details, but enough came through to understand the shape of what was happening. The debris field near Halden's Reach, where the Krell Ascendancy had built its staging facilities, was surrounded methodically over the course of several hours, not with a sudden overwhelming strike, but with a patient, deliberate positioning that closed off every avenue of escape before any confrontation began. "They are not rushing," Kessa observed, watching a simplified tactical display that Colonel Doyle had allowed us to view. "I expected urgency. Anger demands speed. This isn't anger," I reminded her gently. "It never was. The first communication sent to the facilities was not a demand or a threat. It was, according to the summary later shared with the delegations, a clear statement identifying the ships as responsible for the attack on Halden's Reach, and offering safe passage to anyone not directly involved in planning or carrying out that attack. A window of several hours was given for that offer to be considered. "They are giving them time to leave," Orun Kethis said when the delegations were briefed that evening, his voice carrying genuine surprise. "Time that allows them to prepare defenses, to call for reinforcements, to strengthen their position. They understand that risk," Colonel Doyle said. "And they are choosing to accept it anyway, because separating the guilty from the uninvolved matters more than tactical convenience." I watched Kessa's expression carefully during that briefing, and I saw something shift in her further, the same slow unraveling of assumption I had watched happen over the previous days. She had expected, I think, something closer to what her own history had taught her to expect from military response. Calculated efficiency prioritized above almost everything else. What she was witnessing instead was efficiency shaped and limited by principle, even when that principle came at a cost. Reports came in gradually over the following 2 days. Some personnel from the staging facilities did leave during the window offered, small transports carrying support workers and non-combatants who had been given clear passage, and, from what I understood, were not pursued or questioned harshly once clear. Others remained, whether out of loyalty, defiance, or the simple belief that the threat presented to them was not as absolute as it appeared. What followed was not described to us in graphic detail, and I did not seek it out, because I did not believe understanding the specifics would help me understand the deeper truth of what was happening. What I learned instead, through careful briefings, and through the changed tone of every officer and diplomat around me, was this: the operation succeeded in disabling the Ascendancy's capability to act again. The individuals directly responsible for planning and executing the attack on Halden's Reach were no longer able to pose a threat to anyone. And remarkably, by every account gathered afterward through independent Concord observers who were permitted limited access once the operation concluded, civilian casualties beyond the immediate combatants were extraordinarily low, lower than almost any comparable operation in recorded galactic history. This should not be possible, Orun said quietly during a follow-up briefing, reading through observer reports with visible disbelief. An operation of this scale, conducted without centralized command, without extensive prior coordination between all participating parties, achieving this level of precision. It defies every model we have for predicting outcomes in decentralized conflict. It's not decentralized in the way you're imagining, I offered. There's no single command structure, that's true, but there's something else holding it together that doesn't require one. Shared values. Shared training, even among those who left service years ago. A shared understanding, deep enough that coordination doesn't need to be explicit to be effective. A shared understanding is not the same as command, Orun said. No, I agreed. It's stronger. In certain situations, command can be disrupted. Shared understanding, when it's real, when it's built over generations, is much harder to break apart. Kessa had been quiet through most of this exchange, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried something I had not heard from her before, a kind of careful, sober respect layered over her earlier unease. I read the final assessment this morning, she said. The Ascendancy's leadership structure has been entirely dismantled. Their capability to organize further action is gone. And yet, according to the report, 3 separate instances were documented where advancing human forces paused their operation, specifically to allow non-combatant personnel, discovered during the engagement, to withdraw safely, even when doing so extended the operation's timeline and increased risk to the personnel conducting it. That doesn't surprise me, I said. It surprises me, Kessa admitted. Deeply. I expected precision aimed at eliminating a threat efficiently. I did not expect precision that remained this careful about who that threat included, even in the middle of active engagement. That's the part I hoped you'd understand eventually, I said. This was never about punishment for its own sake. It was about making sure this specific harm could never happen again, while holding on to exactly who deserved to bear that consequence, and refusing to let it spread beyond them. Admiral Bennett addressed the full delegation 2 days later, once the operation had concluded and initial assessments were complete. She looked exhausted, in a way that suggested the days since our first meeting had cost her something significant, though her composure remained steady throughout. The threat to Halden's Reach, and to any settlement the Krell Ascendancy might have targeted afterward, has been removed, she said. I want to be clear about what this was, and what it was not. This was not retribution carried out for its own satisfaction. It was not an attempt to send a message through overwhelming force. It was the direct, necessary removal of people who demonstrated, through their actions, that they would continue causing harm if left capable of doing so. And the message it sends regardless of intent? Orun asked carefully. I understand that a message will be received, whether we intended to send one loudly or not, Bennett said. I would ask that the message received be the accurate one. Not that humanity responds to conflict with unlimited force. Not that we act outside all restraint when provoked. The message, if there is one worth taking from this, should be simpler than that. We protect what matters most to us, with a seriousness that does not waver, and we hold that seriousness together, with a discipline that does not let it spread beyond where it belongs. Kessa raised a question then, that I had been waiting for someone to ask since the beginning. Admiral, what becomes of the relationship between the Concord and humanity going forward? Trust, once tested this severely, does not simply return to its previous shape. Bennett considered the question for a long moment before answering. I don't think it should return to its previous shape, she said. I think it should grow into something more accurate. We are not a threat to anyone who has not chosen to become one to us, or to those we're responsible for protecting. That has always been true, even when it wasn't visible. I would rather the Concord understand that clearly now, than continue operating under assumptions that might eventually lead to a much larger misunderstanding. The briefing ended with fewer questions than I expected, not because the delegations had run out of concerns, but because, I think, they had run out of words adequate to the moment. Something had shifted permanently in how they understood the quiet, cooperative species that had shared their station, their trade routes, and their tentative alliance for years, without ever revealing what sat beneath that cooperation. Later that evening, I found Ethan Marsh again, near the lower observation deck, the same place I had found him 5 days earlier, carrying grief he had not yet allowed himself to fully feel. This time, his posture was different, still heavy, but no longer suspended in that terrible stillness I had witnessed before. It's done, he said, before I had a chance to ask. I heard, I said, sitting down beside him. My cousin's memorial service is in 3 days, he said quietly. Colonel Doyle is letting me take leave to attend. I'm glad, I said, and I meant it, though the words felt small against the size of what he was carrying. He was quiet for a while, watching the stars the way so many of us had that week, searching them for something none of us could quite name. I keep thinking about what I said to you that first night, he finally said, about feeling clear instead of angry. I still feel that way, even now that it's over. Clear, not satisfied, not relieved exactly, just clear, like something that needed to be true finally is. I think that's as close to peace as this kind of week allows, I said. He nodded slowly, and we sat together in silence for a while longer, two people among thousands across a dozen worlds who had lived through something that would not be fully understood by history for a long time, if it ever was completely. Behind us, the station continued its quiet hum, the same as it always had, and yet entirely different now, the way a person sounds the same after revealing something true about themselves, even though everyone listening understands they will never hear that voice quite the same way again. 3 weeks passed before Meridian Station began to feel like itself again, though I am not certain it ever fully returned to what it had been before. The corridors filled once more with the ordinary business of a shared outpost, trade negotiations, research exchanges, the small daily friction and friendship of different species learning to work alongside one another. But underneath all of it, something had settled into place that had not existed before, a kind of quiet, mutual understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud to be felt. Halden's Reach was rebuilding. I saw the updates when they came through, images of the school dome under reconstruction, painted yellow again, exactly as the colony administrator had insisted on the first time. Grain fields were replanted. Families who had lost neighbors, and in some cases lost more than that, were slowly finding their way back to something resembling ordinary life, carried forward by the same quiet resilience that had defined the colony from the beginning. I visited Kessa's office one afternoon, something I had done often over the years we had known each other, though this visit felt different from the easy, familiar meetings we used to share. She was reviewing a stack of Concord reports when I arrived, and she set them aside immediately, gesturing for me to sit. I have been asked to prepare a formal assessment, she said, on revised protocols for Concord settlements operating near or alongside human colonies, specifically regarding facilities involving children. That's a significant shift, I said. It is, she agreed. The Council has requested detailed recommendations on defensive protections, emergency shelter reinforcement, and expedited response procedures, all specifically framed around minimizing any possibility of harm reaching children in joint settlements. I have never seen a policy proposal move through preliminary approval this quickly. I imagine the last few weeks made the case fairly persuasively, I said. Kessa allowed a small, tired smile. That may be understating it slightly. I smiled too, though the moment carried a weight beneath its lightness that neither of us needed to name aloud. "Can I ask you something, Daniel?" she said after a moment. "Something more personal than diplomatic." "Of course." "Do you believe humanity is dangerous?" I considered the question seriously, because I understood she was not asking it carelessly. "I think humanity is capable of being extremely dangerous," I said. "I don't think that's separate from who we are the rest of the time. I think it's connected to it. The same depth of feeling that makes us protective of children is the same depth of feeling that makes us generous with strangers, loyal to friends, willing to rebuild something as small and specific as a yellow schoolhouse, instead of just any shelter that would function adequately. It's not two different sides of us. It's one thing, showing up differently depending on what's required." Kessa nodded slowly, turning that over the way she often did before responding. "I think, before this happened, I saw only the generous side clearly. I understood intellectually that the other side existed, but I did not understand it, not really, not until I watched it happen." "Most people don't get to see it happen," I said. "Most of history, most days, most interactions, humanity presents exactly what you saw before all of this. Curious, cooperative, occasionally difficult in small ordinary ways, but fundamentally invested in building things alongside others, rather than tearing them down. What happened at Halden's Reach isn't the common thread running through daily human life. It's the exception that reveals what the whole fabric is actually made of underneath. An exception that reveals the truth," Kessa repeated softly. "That is a difficult thing to hold alongside everything else I know about your people." "I understand," I said, "but I'd rather you hold it accurately than not hold it at all. Fear built on misunderstanding leads to worse outcomes than respect built on clear understanding, even when that understanding includes something uncomfortable." She was quiet for a long moment, looking out through the small viewport in her office, toward the slow-turning stars beyond. "There is something else I wanted to ask," she said eventually. "Something I have been hesitant to raise." "Go ahead," I said. "Do you believe your people could forgive us? Not the ascendancy. They were never truly part of any recognized Concord government, and their actions were condemned universally the moment they became known. I mean the wider Concord itself. The initial reaction in that first briefing, treating this as a matter for formal grievance and proper channels, dismissive in a way that, looking back, feels deeply inadequate to what had actually happened. I thought carefully about how to answer her, because I understood this question mattered to her beyond the scope of formal diplomacy. It mattered to her as a friend, someone who had spent years building trust with people she genuinely cared about, and who now worried that trust had been permanently altered by a misstep made in the earliest, most disorienting hours of a crisis no one had been prepared to fully understand. "I think forgiveness isn't really the right framework here," I said slowly. "Nobody in the Concord caused what happened to those children. The initial response was a misunderstanding, not an act of harm. Misunderstanding something you haven't yet learned to see clearly isn't the same as wrongdoing. It's simply a gap in understanding, and gaps like that can be closed, the way this one is already closing." "But it revealed something uncomfortable," Kessa said. "That the Concord did not initially grasp the seriousness of what had happened, not the way it deserved to be grasped." "It did," I agreed. "And I think the honest answer is that humanity doesn't need an apology for that gap, not really. What matters more is what happens now that the gap is closed. Whether the lesson gets carried forward, built into how joint settlements are protected, how emergencies involving children are prioritized, how quickly serious threats get treated seriously, instead of processed through routine channels first. If that lesson holds, then the discomfort of learning it becomes worth something. If it fades once the immediate memory fades, then it was never really learned at all." Kessa nodded slowly, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. "I intend to make certain it does not fade, not while I have any influence over Concord policy." "I believe you," I said, and I meant it completely. We sat together for a while longer in comfortable silence, the kind we had shared many times over the years, before any of this happened, though it felt earned differently now, tested and strengthened, rather than simply familiar. "I have one more question," Kessa said eventually, a small, careful smile touching her expression for the first time in what felt like weeks. "A lighter one, if you will permit it." "Please," I said, grateful for the shift. Your Admiral Bennett said something during our final briefing that I have not been able to stop thinking about. She said humanity's patience was real, but that it existed alongside a line that does not move. I have been trying to understand how those two things coexist without contradiction. Patience implies flexibility. A line that does not move implies rigidity. How do you reconcile them? I thought about the question for a long moment, watching the same stars Kessa had been watching earlier, the ones that had witnessed nearly every important conversation we had shared over the past several weeks. I think, I said slowly, patience isn't about being flexible on what matters. It's about being flexible on almost everything else, so that the one thing that doesn't move has room to stand clearly, without getting lost among 100 smaller disagreements. If we treated every disagreement, every difference, every friction point between species with the same absolute seriousness we reserve for something like this, we'd never be able to build anything together. Patience makes room for cooperation on everything negotiable, and having one clear line that isn't negotiable is exactly what makes all that patience possible, because everyone involved eventually learns where the edges actually are and stops testing them by accident. Kessa considered this carefully, then nodded, as though something had finally clicked fully into place after weeks of turning it over in her mind. I think, she said, that is the clearest explanation of your species I have heard in 11 years of studying them. High praise, I said, allowing myself a small smile. Earned praise, she corrected gently. We sat together a while longer, until the shift bell chimed somewhere down the corridor, signaling the ordinary business of the station continuing on around us. Trade meetings and supply schedules and the 1,000 small tasks that made up daily life aboard Meridian Station. Kessa gathered her reports, preparing to return to her work on the new Concord protocols, and I found myself lingering near the viewport a moment longer, watching the stars the way I had so many nights over the past several weeks. I thought about Ethan Marsh, back on duty now after attending his cousin's memorial, carrying his grief quietly, but no longer suspended in that terrible stillness I had first witnessed. I thought about the yellow schoolhouse rebuilding itself, piece by piece on Halden's Reach, children's drawings of spaceships likely already taped up somewhere inside its unfinished walls. I thought about Admiral Bennett, who had delivered warnings without raising her voice, and who had insisted, again and again, on restraint even in the middle of something that could easily have justified far less of it. And I thought about what it meant that an entire galaxy of species, some of whom had known humanity for generations, had needed this single terrible event to finally understand something that had been true about us all along, quietly present beneath every trade agreement and shared meal and casual friendship built across the years. Not a threat waiting to happen, a promise, kept consistently, whether anyone was watching closely enough to notice or not. Humanity had not changed during those weeks. We had simply been seen clearly, perhaps for the first time, by neighbors who had mistaken our patience for the whole of who we were, rather than understanding it as one part of something much deeper, much older, and far more certain than any policy or treaty could ever fully capture. I left the observation deck that evening with something I had not expected to feel after everything that happened, a quiet, steady sense of hope, not because the tragedy at Halden's Reach could ever be fully undone. It could not, and no amount of rebuilding would erase what had been lost there, but because something true had been revealed clearly, understood accurately, and carried forward into something better, a new understanding between species that, however painfully earned, might prevent something like this from happening again. The stars outside Meridian Station looked exactly the same as they had every other night since I arrived, unchanged and distant and quietly indifferent to everything happening beneath them. But the people living beneath those stars, human and Alivan and Thrask and every other species, sharing that fragile, growing peace, understood each other a little more completely now than they had before. And somewhere among those stars, on a small colony world with fields of grain growing again under artificial light, a schoolhouse painted yellow continued rising slowly back into place, built by people who understood, better than anyone, that some things are simply worth protecting completely, without hesitation, without negotiation, and without ever needing permission to begin. That, I had come to understand, was the truest thing about being human, not the quiet patience the galaxy had always seen so clearly, not even the fierce, disciplined resolve it had only now discovered underneath, but the simple, unwavering fact that both of those things had always existed together, inseparable, the whole time, waiting only for the right moment to be fully understood.